This is Akashvani. In the program Insights, now we bring you a discussion on government efforts to tame inflation and maintain high growth rate. The participants are Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, economic analyst, and Anubha Rotagi, anchor.
Mr. Bhattacharjee, in the last few years, high inflation has been a major challenge for governments and central banks worldwide, including India. While in a lot of major economies, inflation has been slow to come down and it has negatively impacted growth. For India, growth has been accelerating while inflation is on a downward trajectory. So, would you say that an effective fiscal monetary coordination has been a major reason for India's success in tackling inflation while keeping a high growth rate?
Well, that's a very good point that you made, Anubha. And let me put it this way that while COVID was a very big shock for the world economy, and lots of economies had to frame their policies, it turned out that India actually did rather smart. Instead of flooding the economy with cash, what the government did was it worked to remove the supply constraints. And because that was the problem, there wasn't any shortage of supply, but there were constraints in terms of the supply chain. Bringing in cash into the economy by giving people extra wouldn't have really helped because the shops weren't open, production mills was not running, service sector was practically stalled totally. So what the government did was it refused to follow that path of pushing people money into people's pocket. Rather, it worked to improve the supply chain management. And the consistent good news that we have had that once COVID impact went definitely out of the economy was able to bounce back. The production processes were all able to revive themselves. And since there wasn't any additional cash floating in the market, the economy did not go into an inflation loop, which would have been a crisis of its own, a shock induced by COVID. Instead, the economy was able to veer around a very soft inflation regime. So the inflation hasn't ever really gone out of kilter. And when we compare the results with the developed world also, we see that there has actually been a very useful learning that the inflationary potential, which could have been one of the major problems for the economy. In fact, if you look at what happened to India during the oil shock of 70s, the two oil shocks of the 70s and the early 90s, in contrast with that, what the government did this time ensured that there wasn't any inflationary potential that got built up in this economy, which is why now we have the phenomena that the RBI is able to ensure that the cost of money supply stays reasonable and inflation, going by the data that's coming along, is not showing up any very unpleasant surprises. There are fluctuations monthly. It has not become a huge problem as has happened in many countries of the world, for which they had to go in for lots of unconventional steps. Yes, Anubha.
So, for Reserve Bank of India, like you said, it's always been a delicate balancing act to tame inflation and yet encourage growth. And like you said, that the RBI, the way the RBI dealt with the inflation and the whole scenario during COVID is also one of the reasons why inflation in India is still within the tolerance band of that the government has mandated. So it appears, in fact, the RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das underscored that stable and low inflation is necessary for sustainable economic growth. And he said that in an event today. So would you say that the central bank is well ahead on its path, to tame the inflation, and it has done that to a large extent? And what have been the reasons? What have been the factors for that?
Well, as I said, the factors that we just discussed, but one of the things to remember is the job of the central bank is never over. After all, it manages the dynamic supply, and that is that of money. So it has to continuously keep on calibrating that supply of money to the needs of the economy, that's the growth rate of the GDP. Now, one of the peculiar things that happen and people often don't realize is that if the growth rate of the economy starts faltering and the money supply doesn't get squeezed, then the inflation that results is extremely cruel for the poorer people. Inflation, as one must understand, is a tax on the poorer people most, because they pay for the higher prices through the immediate rise in the price of food items and then going on to daily essentials and so on and so forth. By ensuring that this doesn't happen, two things. It's ensuring that people's confidence level that inflation will not grow out of, will not become unmanageable is kept, that conviction raised on. And when that conviction stays, then the second thing that comes along is that people then feel confident to take up enterprises, then people feel that they can invest in a product or in a service. For the poorer people, this is very important because they aren't getting employment per se, but they need to get self-employed. And if that self-employed needs reasonable return on the goods that they'll buy, on the services that they'll deliver. If inflation keeps playing havoc, then it becomes very difficult for them to plan anything. And at the income base that we are talking about, this becomes an extremely difficult game for them to play. So as a result, what can happen is if inflation goes out of control, then people lose the urge to do productivity activity. They sit back, they just, and also social evils start cropping in. So managing inflation is a very major socially useful productive act, I would say. Yes, Anubha.
The government, too, on its part, has been taking a slew of measures to tame inflation. In fact, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman spoke about this in Parliament recently. So can you highlight some of the measures and how important these measures have been in bringing down inflation?
The government's role in all of this, and I'm talking about both the central and the state government, is to ensure that it stays within its budget. The government cannot provide jobs to everyone in the economy. That's not the government's job. What the government should instead do is create conditions for people to find jobs. Now, how can the government do that? By, fine, have a string of social security benefits. But beyond that, ensure that it doesn't unnecessarily become a drag on the economy. So if the government says, no, people are poor, so I must provide them handouts, then what happens is that those handouts themselves become the reason why the government borrows. And when the government borrows excessively, then obviously that means there's excess money supply in the economy. And that excess money supply then goes on to raise inflation. So the very same people whom the government would want to help become the victims of the government's generosity. And they lose their opportunity. This is a trick that is often not understood, that there is no, magic wand to ensure people become prosperous. You have to be diligently supplying or helping people to manage their finances by offering a stable and predictable inflationary environment. And that ensures that growth will be rising up fast. And that also means that the government has to ensure that it doesn't borrow more from the economy, which means that there's that word fiscal deficit, that the government keeps the fiscal deficit under control.
Food is a major component in retail inflation. How is the MSP for Agri Products related to inflation and growth?
The farmers need social safety and the farmers need income protection. And frankly speaking, which income group in India, the poorer income group, doesn't need a social safety net? Obviously, it is a no-brainer that at a per capita income of average of around $2,600 per year, India obviously is in a position where lots of people would need the social safety net. We are a poor country in terms of the fact that the per capita income of the country is still low. But for that, you cannot go around mandating an income net. For instance, today, let's assume, going by what she's saying, we say that all farmers will get a assured income, an assured pension. Brilliant. But then what happens to the landless laborers? They should also get a pension. In that case, what should happen to the industrial workers? They should also get a pension. What happens to the people on the urban areas, the poorer people working in construction sites and other places? Shouldn't they need a pension? I mean, what decides that they shouldn't get a pension and a farmer should get a pension? In the European world, everybody will get a pension at some stage in the world. But today, we cannot be thinking of that sort of a pensionary benefits. It's impossible. If the government could have given, which government wouldn't give? I mean, every government comes through popular vote. So the government's first impulse would be to give a social security net, a pension net. The fact that they can't give it is because their hands are tied. And if their hands are not tied, which we discussed earlier, then what will happen is that the income that they will borrow, the borrowing that they'll do from the market to provide that income will create an inflationary spiral that will make India's inflation reach stratospheric height. Next door, if people want to have an example, they should look at what's happening in our next door neighbors like Pakistan or what happened in Sri Lanka. Urge to give that sort of a social security to everybody has landed them in the mess that they are in today. And it's impossible to think of that sort of a situation. We know that people need safety, but it can only be provided gradually and by providing it to almost every sort of community gradually. So one part of it which the government has given is the food safety law or the National Food Security Act. which ensures that people get at least a basic amount of food every month. To say that this isn't a pension would be a very peculiar discussion.
So, despite global headwinds and prevailing economic conditions, India's growth rate has been outpacing most forecasts, and RBI has projected the economy to grow at 7% for 2024-25. Looking at the last few years, what are the factors that have contributed to the growth rate that India has been achieving consistently in the last few years, outpacing the most of the forecasts that have been made?
So basically, what the government has been doing over the past few years is that it has been creating two things. It has been creating an environment in which it's easier for people to navigate their lives. And one of the important things that the government has been doing is that it's doing two things. So it has to be looked at from the entire structure. For instance, there's often a discussion that is the government giving benefits to business? Yes, it is giving benefits to business. Why does it give the benefit to the business? That allows business to expand. What does that do? That creates the series of things which the economy needs. And one of the major things you'd find the government giving incentives to the business is typically which sector? The infrastructure sector. So ports, airports, refineries, roads, railways, steel. What are these? These are the ones which need a huge amount of investment. The government cannot provide that investment. The private sector is coming in to provide that investment. And why is the private sector coming in? Because they're assured that there's a reasonably good degree of return that we can generate because the inflation is under control. When they're doing these sort of businesses, one of the important things to remember is that these businesses will not create jobs. Mm-hmm. It's absurd to think that these businesses will create a huge number of jobs. But these businesses, by creating this infrastructure, creates the avenues for people to create other sort of employment opportunities. So what it does, for instance, we are saying that a vendor should go around and be able to earn a good living. But if the roads don't work, if the electricity supply for making his food is very costly, if there are problems on the way of how to run his enterprise, there's no way that vendor can display his ware. So, what the government is doing is government is saying that, fine, I want business to create the infrastructure. That infrastructure of being able to travel or being able to navigate across the country allows people to get better life chance. For instance, today you're finding a huge number of people being able to move from one part of the country to another without disturbances. If you didn't have the road network, which has become so impressive, it wouldn't have been possible. Look at the way anybody who lives in, say, a city like Bangalore or Mumbai or Delhi would see this fleet of these buses which have come up in different parts of the city, private buses, but which provide such timely travel from the eastern states of India to these cities. How are they able to do that? Because the roads have come into place. Very good quality roads which can take the workers from one part of the country to another at an assured time. That is called ease of doing business. So that is allowing the poorer people to come into the business. And what is therefore helping in this entire process? By creating these opportunities, it's allowing the poorer people therefore to rise up in their income levels. Now, what is there for the middle class? The middle class therefore gets an opportunity to pay assured taxes, which doesn't change much, and a steady hand of what sort of policies would be there. Policies which are not directed at a few, but policies which are like mass policies. And therefore, this combination is what is helping the economy to thrive.
You were listening to a discussion on government efforts to tame inflation and maintain high growth rate. The participants were Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, Economic Analyst, and Anubha Rotagi, Anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.
आज की तारीख